welcome back. Today we're continuing our series on Halloween tropes. We're not going to do as many as we did last week. Last week there were 20 book recommendations. This week, because we're doing one trope, there's only going to be 10 recommendations. So today's trope is going to be vampires. So let's just get into it. The first book recommendation is, of course, going to have to be Dracula by Bram Stoker. And if you are living under a rock, that is about an English lawyer who gets sent to Transylvania to work on the real estate account of Count Dracula. And while he's there at the castle of Count Dracula, he begins to suspect that things aren't as they should be. The Count makes his way to England, and things happen to the lawyer's family and friends, and they have to stop Count Dracula. It is a classic vampire novel, which actually was inspired by the real-life case of Mercy Brown, I believe, in New England. Bram Stoker heard about this case and it inspired him to write the novel. So, little fun history fact right there. The next recommendation is Vampire Knitting Club by Nancy Warren. And Nancy Warren is quite a prolific author, actually. She has written a lot of these murder mysteries, and I am so sorry if you can hear that siren. They're testing the tornado weather siren, 12 o'clock every Thursday. So thank you for that. Anyway, the Vampire Knitting Club is about a young woman who goes to her grandmother's knitting shop only to discover that her grandmother has been murdered, and she has to solve her murder, and she gets the help of her grandmother's knitting club, who just so happen to be vampires that live under the shop. And it sounds really weird, but it is just the warm, fluffiest, coziest book about vampires that you'll ever read. It is adorable. And there's not much spice. There is a little romance between one of the vampires and the main character, but it's not a spicy book in the least. It's just really warm and fuzzy. The next recommendation is going to be, and I know I'm going to get hate for this, but I'm just putting it out here anyway, Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. I know, but hear me out. When this came out in like 2006, 2007-ish, that era, it was huge. It blew up. And it is not the greatest book. I mean, I'll just go ahead and say that. No, it is not the greatest book in the world, not the greatest vampire book, but it was a cultural phenomenon. And as such, I felt like it did deserve some recognition. So whether you agree or not, that's fine, but that's why it is on this list. It was huge when it came out, and it's still popular today with the YA set. And again, it's not the best book out there, not the best vampire book, but it is a cultural phenomenon. Like, it's big for a reason. And as such, I felt it deserved its own mention here. The next recommendation is My Roommate is a Vampire by Jenna Levine. This is a relatively newer release in the last few years. She already has her sequel to this book out, and I've heard the sequel isn't as good as this first book, but the first book, My Roommate is a Vampire, is adorable. This young woman who's down on her luck needs to find a roommate quickly, and she finds a listing for an apartment, and her roommate turns out to be a vampire, and shenanigans ensue. Some spiciness occurs, but not that much. It is definitely PG-13, maybe R, but it's just a sweet book. And the cover is so cute, adorable. Again, it's a shame that I've heard the sequel isn't as good as the first book, but this first book is adorable. and definitely deserves a mention on this list. Next recommendation is Glass Houses by Rachel Kane. Now, this is not a fluffy vampire romance book. This is a dark YA horror novel about a girl away at college. The town where the college is at is a town that is run by vampires, and she gets on the bad side of one of the vampire gang bosses, and she has to leave campus and move in with some roommates who are also not on the best side of the vampire gangs. They protect her and keep her safe. It had a lot of high school drama, I would say. A certain level of mean girl-ness and cattiness, but the vampires were dark and they weren't nice. One of the roommates is a ghost, so there's a paranormal romance that starts to develop. Again, there's no spice, or at least in the first book, because this is a series. The next recommendation is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. And I have had to buy this book 2 or 3 times now because I kept lending it out and I would never get it back. So I refuse to lend this book out again because she is a thick book, and I never get it back, and I love it. For the longest time, this was one of my favorite books, and I still do love it. I won't say it's one of my favorites, but when it comes to vampires, it's definitely one of my favorite vampire books. And I don't want to spoil anything, but it's a time travel book in that, well, it's not time travel. It's a dual timeline book. It's a dual timeline book. So part of it is set in 1960s, where the main character, her father, has disappeared in Europe and she has to go on an adventure to find him. And the other part is set in the 1930s, where the girl's father, when he's in college at Oxford, I believe, he and this woman have to team up to find this guy's professor who has disappeared. And I'm not going to spoil anything, but suffice it to say, Dracula is the reason these people have disappeared. And it is such an interesting take on the Dracula story. And when I say it is rich in history and lore, and the settings were so vibrant, this is a beautifully written literary horror adventure novel. I don't even know where to begin to describe it. It is such a fascinating book. If you like history, if you like Europe, if you like just reading about other places or other timelines, this story is beautifully well written. Elizabeth Kostova researched this book for over 10 years, and she won a prize while she was writing it for like the best book in the works or something like that. Like, it had a name, but very well researched and beautifully well written. The next book is actually a series, Cirque du Freak by Darren Shane. This is a series that follows a middle school boy who becomes the assistant to a vampire who travels with a freak show, the Cirque du Freak. And it is definitely middle grade, maybe YA. I would say YA, because it is dark. For a middle school book, it is kind of dark. Like in the first book, the boy has to fake his death and watch his parents at the funeral and watch them mourn for him. And it's, I don't know that I would say middle grade, but if you classify it as middle grade, then it's dark for a middle grade book. So maybe YA. Lots of interesting characters, lots of interesting settings. and a lot of stuff going on. It is not a boring book. It is a twist on the classic coming-of-age adventure story. The next recommendation is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. I'm sorry, you know I had to throw at least one Stephen King recommendation up here. So, Salem's Lot by Stephen King is about a town that gets taken over by vampires. And when I say taken over, I mean literally pretty much everybody in this town gets turned into a vampire or becomes a vampire's thrall, like where they serve the vampire and keep them safe during the day. I like that even though it's an adult book, the main character or one of the main characters is a boy. So you get that perspective. A fun story about this book, actually. My mom read it when she was a teenager. Because yes, Stephen King has been writing books for that long. Sorry, Mom, you're old. Love you. But she read it when she was a teenager, and she was up reading it late one night when everybody else was asleep, and she has a lamp next to her bed, and she sees a shadow blocking the light that's next to her bed. And she looks up, and her brother has sleepwalked into her room and is just standing there at the edge of her bed, staring at her. And she had just got to the part of the book where the boy hears the vampire knocking at the window. So right as she gets to that part, a shadow falls over her, and it's her brother standing there at the edge of the bed staring at her as he's sleepwalking. So I would have pissed myself. But anyway, every time I think of that book, I think of that story and it makes me laugh. The next recommendation is by Stephen King's son, actually, Joe Hill, Nosferatu. If you know, you know, Nosferatu is a classic vampire tale. And like when you think of vampires, like you think of Dracula and you think of Nosferatu. So he wrote this book with a twist on Nosferatu, where a single mom has to protect her son from Nosferatu. I didn't want brown or orange, and I'm sitting here doing brown and orange. Whatever, okay. It's just a modern take on a classic tale. The last recommendation on this list is a Grady Hendrix recommendation, which again, if you remember my last video, I like to think of Grady Hendrix as horror light. His books are horror books with enough humor in it to keep it light. They're amazing books for those of us who like horror, but maybe don't like all the spooks. But this one is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. And in it, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. A suburb of ladies who have a book club, and a new person moves to their neighborhood and spooky things start happening. It turns out that this new neighbor is a vampire, and they have to figure out how to keep him from destroying their neighborhood, and in particular their husbands and this one teenager that's falling in love with him, which is kind of it, because he's older, like not old, but like too old to be going out with basically a teenager. Like I think she's 16 or 17 and he's like in his early 30s or something. So like kind of ick, but I digress. So those are my 10 vampire recommendations. So let me finish this look. So here's the final look. Thank you for coming back and watching this series. Come back Tuesday for more Halloween trope book recommendations. Make sure you like and subscribe and comment below with more vampire recommendations. I love all the spooky books, so leave them below and tell me what you thought of mine. Have you read any of these books? What did you think about them? So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!